Back in June of 2011, Neil Peart gave an interview to Music Radar with Joe Basso, and in this interview he said something very interesting and I think provocative about John Bonham. I'm going to tell you what that is in just a minute, but first I want you to listen to something that Tommy Lee had to say about John Bonham. And stick around after that because I'm going to play not only a clip from Neil Peart and give you my commentary, but I'm going to let you listen to a very funny and interesting clip from Stuart Copeland and Nick Mason about who is their favorite drummer, and I'll give you one hint, it's not John Bonham. Alright, so right now let's listen into what Tommy Lee had to say about John Bonham.
As soon as I was tall enough to get up and open the kitchen cabinets and pull out pots and pans and all that shit, I would just set everything up and just my poor parents. I must have been born to do this. John Bonham from Led Zeppelin was my hero. Everything about that guy. His sound, his feel. He had this really, really beautiful, a super heavy foot, which means in drum lingo, that's just like big bass drum, like
yeah.
Everything's real solid in the bass drum. So he had a heavy foot, and he always played like, if we call it late or laid back. The snare drum always comes like a little late, like a boom. It's always like on the backside of the beat, and that's a true, you either have that or you don't. It's not something you can teach somebody or learn.
Alright, so that's what most of us think when we think of John Bonham, and I find Tommy Lee's observation about him playing behind the beat very interesting because I think this kind of slappy behind the beat rhythm is what gives John Bonham his real power. It's not just the volume and how hard he hits, it's that slap back, delayed hit on the snare. You also get that from other drummers, and one that I would point out would be Phil Rudd. Although Phil Rudd is equally capable of playing ahead of the beat, but he's really good at playing behind the beat, so go listen to, for example, the intro to the song Back in Black. Now, what I really want to focus on here, of course, is what Neil Peart had to say about John Bonham, and there is a reason why the Tommy Lee thing is relevant, and I'll tell you in a minute. First, let's go to the quote from Neil Peart, and this has to do with drum soloing. Now, here is Neil Peart quote. Stuart Copeland, who's a good buddy of mine, he's very anti-drum solo too. Yet he jokes that when he was a kid around the same era I was, that any drummer who didn't play drum solos was lame. But it can be too much of a good thing, sure. Take John Bonham, who's a drummer I greatly admire. I watch some of his performances and they're fantastic, but it gets long and self-indulgent. End quote. Now, he is far from being anti-solo. He is a drummer who came up admiring Buddy Rich and Gene Krupa, and he thinks that playing solos is exciting and it's energetic and beautiful and it draws new players into the art. All these things are well and good, and I wouldn't take issue with any of them. In the case of John Bonham, I think that he was much more of a groove drummer. He was made to play with a band. His entire spirit, soul, and identity as a drummer is locked in to providing that foundation for a band to play over. His technique is interesting on its own, but it's more interesting when it's combined with other musicians. Now, with Peart, I think the case is slightly different. For Neil Peart, he is trying to use his drum solo as a place for composition. When he wrote drum parts for Rush Song, he also composed. He didn't just keep time. So when it comes down to an actual drum solo, what Neil Peart is trying to do is make a piece of music almost along the line of a symphonic piece of music, a piece of music that not only entertains the crowd but satisfies his need for creativity and self-expression. So let's listen into something that Neil Peart himself said about what he puts into a drum solo.
A drum solo was a mainstay in every band I was in, and I slowly began to build an approach to soloing. Most of that approach was learned from other drummers, of course, sometimes from records, but mostly from watching them. How I love to watch drummers play. I've written before that growing up during the 60s in southern Ontario, I wasn't able to see American or British bands except on television, but I was fortunate that the Toronto area music scene was so vibrant at that time. I remember reading an amusing comment in an interview with Stuart Copeland when he said that as a grown-up musician, he didn't like drum solos, But when he was a kid, any drummer who didn't play a solo was sneered at. That was how it was then, and in a way, I think it was good for me to learn about drum solos from being in the audience, rather than from records or from behind the drum set. As a young music fan, watching from the crowd, I picked up on what was exciting, what was dynamically effective, and what was musical. I soon realized that some of the best and most accomplished drummers were not necessarily good soloists. Sometimes they could be wonderful accompanists, with all the groove, dynamics, and technique the music required, but their solos would be a stiff display of rudiments or an aimless ramble of rhythmic notions leading nowhere.
All right, and I think this is what he's trying to say about John Bonham's solos, is that they're just displays of naked technique and they don't really have any structure to them and they don't go anywhere. Now, what I would like to ask you is, do you agree with this? Do you find John Bonham's drum solos boring? And if so, do you, by contrast, find Neil Peart's drum solos interesting? I will tell you that although I am a massive Neil Peart fan and a massive John Bonham fan, I would not listen to either one of their drum solos in a live setting all the way through. I would listen to about a minute or so of each of them soloing. I don't find drum solos to be that interesting, and even though I'm a drummer myself and I can see the value in doing a drum solo, I feel like the old jazz tradition of putting like a drum break in a song, a few measures, 30 seconds, 45 seconds, a minute at the most, is probably good enough. But just to be fair here, I'll also say I feel the same way about guitar solos. I like guitar solos when they're in a song. I'm not as interested in them when it's just somebody playing alone on a stage. So I think that solo instruments at all have a tendency to get a bit boring, but I would support Neil Peart's general idea that the more composition and structure the drum solo has, the better. But I would add something else to that in the case of drums, which is that they need to have hooks in them. They need to have crowd pleasers in them. And an example of that I would throw out there would be Peter Criss. Back in the day, of all the extended drum solos that I found that I could listen to, it would be Peter Criss, because his drum solos were created to get the crowd involved. Even though he's not as good of a drummer as Neil Peart or John Bonham, not even in the same league, it seems as though Kiss took the time to make sure that their drum solos would always be pleasing to the crowd. And one of my channel members had commented some time ago that Neil Peart in Rush toured with Kiss in the early days and borrowed a lot of Peter Criss's drum solo elements for his own solos, and the ideas behind it of getting that crowd pleasing hooks involved. And Neil Peart does a little bit of this in his drum solos. So again, I don't think that extended drum solos are that interesting regardless of who's doing them, but I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are. Now, I want you to stay tuned to listen to the following clip where Nick Mason and Stuart Copeland both pick their favorite drummer, and it's probably going to be a surprise to you. And before you listen to the clip, I would say that I actually agree with what they're saying. The drummer they pick is criminally underrated, and the reason they give for him being underrated, I think, is quite true. Also, this drummer is someone who is basically soloing all the time as he's playing along with a band, but I don't remember him ever doing an actual drum solo. So let's listen into what Stuart Copeland and Nick Mason had to say regarding who is their favorite drummer.
And the one thing I see that you have in common is your favourite drummer is the same person.
Yeah,
Mitch Mitchell. We worked this out last night. We sorted out the hierarchy last night.
That's exactly right. And I knew we were really on it because the table next door were beginning to eavesdrop. Yeah. And after 5 minutes, they'd both actually gone to sleep.
That's right. Yeah, so we lost them. Yeah. We lost them by the main
So you both
chorus.
agree that Mitch Mitchell was your favourite drummer?
Our favourite.
Of all time. This was Jimi Hendrix's drummer. I think we should explain to those of you who are not as old as, let's say, we are.
Well, that's the travesty right there. This great towering, this monument of drums was Jimi Hendrix's drummer.
Well, how would you describe him?
Well, Jimmy was Mitch's guitarist.
Okay, first.
Yeah.
All right, so if you're not familiar with Mitch Mitchell, I encourage you to go out and listen to him right away because he is a drumming genius. This is what I think, but what really matters is what you think. So if you have an idea about this or any other topic connected to classic or contemporary music, please drop it in the section below and remember to like and subscribe. Also, if you're enjoying the videos, you can click on the thanks button right down there below, or if you prefer, you can use the Buy Me a Coffee link to go to the Buy Me a Coffee site and leave a donation there. Thanks a lot.